The transition to renewable energy is a challenge that governments are increasingly placing at the forefront of their agendas. As we've heard today from both the oil industry and from renewable energy advocates, the competing interests in funding the transition are substantial. To discuss, we're joined live from ADIPEC in Abu Dhabi by Thomas Storch. He's Managing Director at Affinity Partners. That's a global growth equity investment firm. He was the Deputy Director of the National Economic Council and Deputy Assistant to the President for International Economic Affairs at the White House. Mr. Storch, as we mentioned earlier, we reported on what the OPEC SecGen mentioned. He warned against cutting investment into fossil fuels, saying that would pose an energy security risk to many countries. Granted, of course, OPEC has vested interest in perhaps making that claim. You would agree that if we are unable to expand supplies of clean energy in line with falling supplies of fossil fuels, you're looking at shocks to price, to supplies that would disrupt a very critical transition point right now.
I think that's right. It's a very important point that we need to invest both in traditional energy to sustain the energy system of today, as well as invest in future energy systems and what's going to drive the energy transition. We need trillions of dollars of investment in energy transition technologies and renewables and energy storage, particularly in the global south. But we also need to be cognizant of maintaining affordability and energy security for our current energy system.
So if I quote you, that means investing in different projects at different stages in different parts of the ecosystem. Now, all this sounds really good on paper, but who makes the call on where you invest in which part? As you mentioned, all these different stages and parts of the ecosystem.
Look, I think that we all have a role to play, which is why I've been encouraged about the approach both at ADIPEC here and at COP coming up in only a few weeks. It's going to be the most inclusive conversation we've had about our energy systems of the future. And that has to involve the private sector, governments, NGOs, multilateral financial institutions. We all have a role to play to shape the enabling environment for projects to come to completion, to fund those projects, and to create the right policy environment to support those projects.
All right, you've spoken about private and public sector working together so that they complement each other rather than compete or contradict each other. We've heard, and you can verify the truth of that, big money players such as BlackRock and State Street dumping ESG funds, what some have called a culture war in the United States, turning against so-called woke capitalism. Is that something we need to be aware right now, when at the very point when we're looking for the private sector to step up in terms of investment in clean energy?
Well, look, I've been a part of energy finance, both from the government perspective when I worked at the White House and at the U.S. Department of Energy, and as a private investor. And, I don't think when investors are making decisions, when companies are in the boardroom, they're thinking as much about culture wars as they are about making good investments as it relates to return on invested capital and good decisions for their shareholders and for their futures. And so, from my perspective, there's quite a bit of capital available for energy transition investments, both from the likes of BlackRock as well as venture capital firms and banks. And so I'm quite optimistic about the role that investors can play in the future of the energy transition.
All right. Money is just one part of it. We've had several analysts, no less than the former U.S. Energy Secretary, mentioning how it is infrastructure that is a pacing item that's holding back a transition to full clean energy. If you do not have the infrastructure, you've got legacy infrastructure, you do not have the grid, the flexibility of grid to bring power to the people. And we saw that in China in 2021, despite the best of intentions there. Are we doing enough on that front to keep pace with good intentions and investment?
I think we need to do more. I think it's a very good point. It's a very good question. Both from a regulatory perspective, from a funding perspective, we need to do more as it relates to infrastructure investing. The World Bank and the multilateral financial institutions need to fund more projects. We need to get the regulatory landscape in better shape And we need to work on public-private partnerships, which is something that, especially in the United States, we lag other parts of the world. So, there are many ideas on the table for how to continue to fund more and better infrastructure projects, but we're held back by a lack of permitting, by regulatory capture, and sort of a lack of coherence in our approach to infrastructure. And we need to do more both in the developed world, but especially in the global south.
And it's a final question. And since you mentioned the global south, you have also referred to the 775 million, mostly in the global south, who do not even at this point have access to electricity. When we talk about clean energy, the transition to that seems very much like a first world problem. Are we paying enough attention to these 775 million people who are several steps behind, even thinking about getting electricity on a daily basis?
I think what that tells us is we can't be overly prescriptive about how we approach getting sort of basic energy dignity and energy justice for large swaths of the world. We can't say there are only certain types of projects that you must do, and otherwise you will have to live in the dark. That's just not acceptable. We need to work with countries around the world and listen to their voices and understand their needs, and not lecture them about how, when, and in what form their energy system should be constructed. It has to be a two-way street, and we need to do much better in those conversations.
Thanks very much for speaking to us this evening. Thomas Storch, Managing Director at Affinity Partners.